In the spring of 1901, a construction crew broke ground on a massive stretch of land in Forest Park, St. Louis, Missouri. They were clearing the site for what would become one of the most celebrated events in American history. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition, the World's Fair. Hundreds of acres of woods, hills, and overgrown terrain were being scraped to bare earth for grand pavilions, lagoons, fountains, and fairgrounds. And then the shovels started hitting things they were not supposed to find. 3 separate foundation systems, stone, massive cut stone, dressed and fitted in ways that suggested serious, intentional construction, not colonial-era farmhouse foundations. Not the footprint of some forgotten homestead from the 1820s. These were the kind of remains that implied a building of significant scale, and they were buried. Not at the surface, not sitting exposed in a field, buried beneath layers of accumulated earth, in ground that official maps had long recorded as undeveloped wilderness. The official story of St. Louis is that the city was incorporated in 1809 and grew from a modest French trading post established in 1764. There should have been no foundations of that scale under those fields. There should have been no cut stone at that depth. There should have been nothing down there at all, but there was. And what happened to that discovery is, in many ways, more disturbing than the discovery itself. The construction crews were redirected. The site reports were folded into logistics paperwork that no longer exists in complete form. The buildings of the World's Fair went up on top of whatever had been down there, and the official record moved on as though nothing unusual had occurred beneath the soil of Forest Park. This is a film about 3 foundations that should not exist, about what they suggest regarding the true depth of North American history, and about why events like the 1904 World's Fair may have served purposes far beyond tourism and national pride. Forest Park in 1901 was not empty land. It had been a public park since 1876, when the city of St. Louis formally designated it as such and began developing its western edges for recreation. Before that, it was a patchwork of private holdings, old hunting grounds, and terrain the city had slowly acquired through the latter half of the 19th century. The land had been surveyed multiple times, walked, mapped, and formally documented, which makes the foundation discoveries significantly harder to explain away. When you survey land, you find things. A survey team does not miss 3 sets of cut stone foundations. They do not overlook massive subsurface stonework when they are walking the terrain with measuring instruments and producing legal plats for city planning purposes. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The surveys of Forest Park from the 1870s and 1880s record no such structures, no ruins, no evidence of prior habitation at the scale that the 1901 excavation crews encountered. This is the first problem with the official explanation, which is essentially that these were remnants of forgotten farmsteads or early settler construction. Forgotten by whom? The surveys were conducted by professional city engineers. The land records were maintained by county clerks, whose entire job was to document prior use and ownership. The idea that 3 substantial foundation systems escape notice across multiple surveys spanning 25 years is not a credible explanation. The second problem is the depth. Accounts from workers involved in the 1901 site preparation, collected years later by local historians rather than any official body, consistently describe the foundations as sitting below natural grade, not below imported fill, below the original soil line. Structures that were built and then abandoned do not sink below natural grade on their own. They either stay at grade or get buried under accumulating material over a very long period of time. The depth implies either that an enormous amount of earth had washed over them in the centuries before 1901, or that they were constructed at a time so distant that the landscape itself had measurably changed around them. Neither of those possibilities fits the standard historical timeline for European settlement of the St. Louis region. The third problem is the stone. The accounts describe cut and dressed masonry, fitted without mortar in some sections, with mortared joints in others. The cutting technique was described by at least one worker as unlike the field stone construction common to the region. Not river cobble, not broken limestone pulled from a creek bed and stacked by early settlers. Quarried material, shaped with intention, placed by people who knew what they were doing with stone on a substantial scale. Who those people were, and when they built, is the question the official record refuses to answer. The accounts describe three distinct foundation systems, and it is worth taking each one seriously on its own terms, rather than lumping them together as the same kind of find. The first was located in the northwestern quadrant of the site, in an area that would eventually be occupied by the fairgrounds central lagoon system. The footprint, as best as can be reconstructed from fragmentary descriptions, was substantial. The walls implied a building with a floor plan larger than most wooden structures that early American settlers built in the Midwest. The stone was light-colored, possibly limestone, and showed evidence of having been worked with tools capable of producing flat, even faces. One account mentions what sounded like a threshold stone, a single large flat piece positioned in a way consistent with a formal entry point. This was not a storage building. This was a structure designed to be entered with some deliberateness. The second foundation was southeast of the first, separated by enough distance that the two structures could not have been parts of the same building. This one was described as deeper, with the uppermost courses of stone sitting further below grade than the first. The masonry here was described differently: tighter jointing, a slightly different stone color, described in some accounts as darker or more yellowish. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. Whether this represents a different quarry source, a different period of construction, or simply the differential weathering of two structures that had sat in the ground for different amounts of time is impossible to determine. What is consistent across multiple accounts is that this second foundation was not a simple rectangle. There appeared to be projecting elements, what might have been pilasters or buttressing, giving the structure a more complex perimeter than a straightforward box. The third foundation was the smallest of the three, and was discovered latest in the excavation sequence as the clearing crews worked further into the terrain. This one was described by some workers as being in better condition than the others, with stone that looked less weathered and joints that were more intact. This detail is strange. If all three structures were built in the same general period and had been sitting in the ground under similar conditions, you would expect similar levels of deterioration. The fact that the third foundation appeared better preserved than the first two opens a set of uncomfortable possibilities. Either it was built more recently than the others, which still places it in a period before any known construction in the area, or it was built from more durable material, or it had been protected in some way the first two had not. No artifact inventory was produced for any of the three sites. No measurements were formally recorded by the construction management team. No archaeologist was called. In 1901, the discipline of archaeology existed and was practiced in the United States. The Smithsonian Institution had been conducting excavations of earthwork mound sites across the Midwest for decades. The decision not to document these foundations was not a product of ignorance about how to document them. It was a choice. To understand why the 1904 World's Fair matters beyond its famous attractions and its introduction of the ice cream cone to the American public, you have to understand what World's Fairs actually were in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were not simply celebrations, they were declarations. The physical expression of a particular historical narrative, staged at enormous expense, for the explicit purpose of showing the world what civilization had achieved and where it had come from. The 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the 1900 Exposition Universelle in Paris, the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. These events shared a common visual language: massive neoclassical buildings in white stucco and plaster, grand boulevards, reflecting pools, ornamental facades that looked, if you did not examine them closely, like permanent stone monuments. They were built fast, from temporary materials, and then torn down almost immediately after the fairs closed. The Chicago Fair's main buildings were demolished within 2 years. Most of the St. Louis Fair structures were gone by 1906. Why build something that elaborate, that expensive, that visually overwhelming, and then destroy it? The answer the Tartaria research community has been developing is that these fairs were not building something new. They were replacing something old. The visual template for the World's Fair buildings did not come from architects inventing a new aesthetic in the 1890s. The neoclassical style, the massive domes, the colonnaded facades, the grand proportions, these were borrowed from something that already existed. From buildings, or the memory of buildings, already standing in various states of use and decay across North America before the fairs were built. This argument is supported by a peculiar set of photographs. World's Fair construction images often show temporary wooden scaffolding going up around structures, whose proportions and stonework look nothing like what you would expect from a hasty fair building. There are photographs from the St. Louis Fair construction, in which the scale of what is being worked on is simply inconsistent with the timeline the official record provides. Buildings of that mass, even in temporary form, required foundations. And foundations, unlike the buildings above them, do not get torn down easily. They get buried. The 3 foundations discovered in Forest Park in 1901 were not the remnants of pioneer farmsteads or the footprints of early French traders' warehouses. The scale was wrong for that. The stone was wrong for that. The depth was wrong for that. What they may have been are the remnants of a prior occupation of this continent by a civilization whose construction capabilities far exceeded what the approved historical narrative assigns to the indigenous cultures of the region, and whose existence has been systematically obscured by a succession of events, the World's Fairs among the most spectacular of them, that replaced the physical evidence of that civilization with a new built environment and a new official story. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904 was organized around a specific commemorative premise. It was celebrating the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, the 1803 transaction by which the United States acquired the territory from France. The celebration was 2 years late, which the organizers attributed to logistical and funding challenges. The Louisiana Purchase territory was, at the time of the transaction, largely unmapped by American or European authorities. The interior of the continent was, from the perspective of Washington and Paris, essentially unknown. Unknown does not mean empty. It means unrecorded by the specific parties conducting the transaction. What was in that territory before the purchase, before French colonial claims, before any European presence at all, is a question that the 1904 fair, by its very nature as a celebration of American territorial acquisition, was structured to never ask. There is a pattern that repeats itself whenever construction projects in American cities encounter certain kinds of anomalous material. It is quieter than conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It is the pattern of the incurious official. The foreman who logs it as irregular fill and moves on. The city engineer who notes the delay without specifying what caused it. The newspaper that covers the fair's grandeur in exhaustive detail, without mentioning what the crews found when preparing the ground. The Sreet. Louis Post-Dispatch covered the 1904 fair extensively. Hundreds of articles across years of preparation and the fair itself. The foundations discovered during site preparation do not appear in those archives in any clear, documented form. What appears are occasional references to site preparation delays, to unexpected ground conditions, to the need to reroute certain construction elements. The language of bureaucratic inconvenience rather than historical discovery. This is how suppression works in practice. It does not require a room full of conspirators deciding what the public will and will not know. It requires only that people in institutional authority treat anomalous findings as logistical problems rather than historical questions. The 3 foundations in Forest Park were obstacles. The fair had a schedule. The schedule was kept. The foundations were buried again, this time under the poured concrete footings of a temporary civilization that would itself be torn down within 2 years, leaving nothing visible at the surface but grass and the familiar landscape of a city park. Forest Park still exists. The art museum built for the fair remains standing on its elevated ground. The land where the central lagoon and the main fairgrounds pavilion stood has been repurposed multiple times in the century since. The foundations, if they are still there, and there is no particular reason to think they were removed, rather than simply built over, are sitting somewhere beneath the surface of one of the most visited parks in Missouri. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of Forest Park have not been conducted with the specific purpose of locating pre-fair subsurface structures. No institution with the resources to conduct such a survey has applied for permits to do so. The questions that the 1901 discovery raises have not been answered. They have not even been formally asked by anyone with institutional standing. What was under Forest Park before the World's Fair arrived? Who built those foundations? How long had they been in the ground? What did the buildings above them look like when they were standing? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine historical questions about a specific place, with specific physical evidence that was observed by living human beings and then deliberately left unexamined. The 1904 World's Fair told the world a story about American civilization, its origins, its progress, its destiny. It was a magnificent story, told in plaster and lagoons and electric light, and it was built, quite literally, on top of something older that nobody was supposed to look at too closely.